several provinces have put out plans to reopen their economies, and that process has begun just this week. So just how the federal government will help them do that, of course, depends on which province you're asking. To get a clearer sense of what the options are, let's bring in our Premier's League. Over in Vancouver, Ujjal Dosanjh, NDP Premier of BC from 2000 to 2001 and former federal Liberal cabinet minister, joins us. Bob Rae, Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 95 and former interim leader of the federal Liberal Party and host of the Political Stripes podcast, joins us from Toronto. And over in Montreal, the Premier of Quebec from 2003 to 2012, former leader of the PC Party from 93 to 98, now partner at McCarthy Tétrault, Jean Charest. Hello, all three of you. Wonderful to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Vassy.
Mr. Charest, I'll start with you as we sort of follow each province as they have announced this week and begun the process to reopen their economies, to loosen restrictions around physical distancing. What do you imagine, and I should say as we await a call between all the premiers tonight and the Prime Minister, their weekly call, what do you imagine the primary ask of the federal government from Quebec is right now, or what should it be?
Well, I think we want to coordinate. We want some cohesiveness in the way we are going to handle this second phase, right? The first phase being the lockdown, second phase being the post-lockdown, pre-vaccine period, which is, I think, Vassy, going to be very laborious. And what comes out of all of this, quite clearly for Canadians, that they understand that it's the provinces who are on the front line, because the provinces run the healthcare systems, the education systems. So they're making the decisions on the opening up. And the circumstances of every province is different. So expect, and even within a province, very different. So I think you can expect different openings and different plans to open up, but basically all on the same line of saying, listen, we need to do more testing, tracing. We need to make sure that we have the pandemic under some level of control. And we need to be able to retract and change our plans if there's a resurgence of the pandemic in our own province.
Mr. Rae, you've been on both sides of it, the provincial side of it and the federal side of it. What is your, assessment or evaluation of the role the federal government needs to play in all of this, especially as we look towards, as Mr. Charest points out, this sort of interim phase between a vaccine and when everything was shut down?
Well, from the very beginning, this pandemic has been about managing two different kinds of risk. The first is obviously the health risk, and Jean has already talked about that in terms of the provinces, I think, having to manage that as best they can. And then there comes the question of the economic risk. And these are both risks to individuals, to all of us, each and every one of us, and it's a risk to the whole of the country. And so I think that the federal role will be an important one and a tricky one, because everybody's in debt. Individuals are in debt. Businesses are in debt. Many businesses won't make it. Cities are in, municipalities are in debt, and the provinces are in bad shape. And the federal government is facing what every national government around the world is facing, and that is an enormous cost to the fisc, as we say, to the health of the federal financial system. And I think that's going to be a big challenge. And I think more and more, I think that the discussions between the premiers and the federal government will be about managing both these risks and how do we get it done with a maximum of cooperation and flexibility. And I think it's going to be hugely challenging. But I have to say, so far, there's been an extraordinary amount of cooperation between both levels of government and the big municipalities around the country. And I think we just need to keep the rhetoric down and focusing on everybody understands how big these challenges are.
Actually, that's a great point that I wanted to jump off with Mr. Dosanjh. I think we have seen a real unprecedented level of cooperation between premiers of all political stripes and the federal government. And I'm wondering, Mr. Dosanjh, your impression of that so far, and if you see it lasting or what challenges to that level of cooperation may arise.
Well, I think it will last for a little while longer. I think we need to wait, implement the opening and reopening of the provinces to the extent possible, and worry about a potential second wave of pandemic. I think until all of that clears, you will see a lot of cooperation. Partly because the federal government has the resources to provide money and support, which is what they've been essentially doing throughout the pandemic. And they've essentially become an ATM machine for the provinces and for the population. They have very little control over what happens in the provinces, and rightly so in terms of the healthcare provision, which is provincial jurisdiction. But I think that ultimately, if you really want, out of this, what you need is a coordinated economic, industrial, and environmental strategy eventually. And if all that the federal government is doing is ceding control, essentially giving money and letting the provinces manage all of that, at the end of it, we might not have a federal government that is able to give any direction to the country, and that is my worry. Federal government has ceded much of the control. They haven't brought in the national emergency. With that, they were able to give a little more direction, despite the exclusive jurisdiction. And my worry is that at the end of it, we will have a federal government that's under a lot more debt, a lot more weakened. And you wouldn't have a national strategy to deal with any of those issues.
What do you think about that, Mr. Charest?
Well, it's an interesting experience for Canadians because through this crisis, I think they saw for themselves how the country operates. Canada is one of the most decentralized federations in the world. It is the provinces who operate the country on a day-to-day basis: emergency rooms, hospitals, daycares, and schools. 60% of the budget of a province, Vashi, is salary. And so the federal government isn't in a position to operate hospitals or the education system. And yes, they're like a holding company. They do transfer money, but they can make it conditional, and they have in a lot of instances. And I think I'm encouraged by what I've seen, because I don't see people arguing jurisdiction in all of this. They want to do what's right. They want to make sure everyone plays the right role. And there's even a lot of interprovincial discussion happening between Quebec and Ontario. I think that's been part of what we've seen. And all of that's encouraging. So the system is working, I think, fairly well.
Mr. Ray, your thoughts on the same subject?
Well, I think it's working so far. I think that it's the trouble is with Ujjal's analogy is no government is an ATM machine. That isn't how the world works. Eventually, the international bankers and others will have something to say. It's a mistake to think that the resources of the federal government are unlimited. They're not. They're greater than that of the provinces and the cities. But we're not the United States. We're not the American economy. We're not a reserve currency. There's a limit to how much money the Bank of Canada can print, what will happen to our dollar, what will happen to interest rates. And I don't think anybody's in a mood for austerity. And we do have low interest rates. And so there's an ability to kind of structure the debt in such a way that it can be paid off. But I do think that when it comes down to talking about this with the provinces and the municipalities, I do think the federal government will have something to say about the conditions under which they will grant or give more money to them, to other sovereign governments and to large municipalities. I don't think Canadians fully understand yet how tough the situation is from a financial point of view for all levels of government. I mean, we're looking at debt and deficit numbers that we've never seen before, and perhaps seen at the end of the Second World War, maybe comparable. But at that point, the economy was coming right back fast, and the country was going right back into recovery. I think the kind of dance that we're in right now, where we're managing the risk, we're managing the health risk, we're managing the economic risk, we're trying to start up again. I think a lot of individuals are still very wary of too much breaking down barriers because they don't want to get sick. And I think all this will play out, and it's going to be very, very interesting. But as I say, I think the important point is there's still a lot of goodwill between the governments. And we, as Canadian citizens, I think we have to say to all of our governments, please stay this course, negotiate, talk, engage, cooperate as much as possible. I think that's where the Canadian public wants their governments to go.
Well, and Mr. Dusange, to the point that Mr. Ray is making, I mean, the cooperation exists right now, but the measures that are being put forth by the federal government, even by the provinces, they are aimed at the next 2 months, the next 3 months. But it's not as though after that a need will not exist, right? It's not as though the key will turn and the economy will jump back to life. We're in this sort of middle ground until there's a vaccine at least. And even then, a recovery is not overnight.
Well, that's true. I mean, obviously, the resources aren't unlimited, and we don't know how long we're going to be in this emergency, which is what it is. And we don't know how long the provinces and municipalities are going to be needing federal largesse and federal money, which is not unlimited. And one should take the long view. Obviously, the consultations should exist. They should improve. They should continue. But ultimately, the governments have to make decisions as to what industries to support, what industries not to support. There's a huge debate around the oil sands. There was a wonderful response from the agricultural community for being given $250 million. Those are the tensions that are going to exist in Canada, if not exacerbate, in the next few weeks. And we need to be ready, and we need to have a lot more deeper and more meaningful dialogue other than simply dishing out money, which is what federal government has been doing while consulting. My worry is that those are issues that nobody's paying much attention to at this time.
I have one quick final question for you, Mr. Charest, just because there's such as Mr. Dusange points out, a debate around it. We are expecting the potential for some help, some more help for bigger companies in the oil patch, the potential for help, I should say. What do you think about the prospect for that? Do you think the federal government should backstop extra liquidity for big oil companies?
By all means, the federal government should be helping out and supporting what has been the #1 export of Canada abroad, A. B, the oil patch. Remember, during the financial crisis of 2008, was generating a lot of economic prosperity and wealth that supported all of the country. So, yes, we do want to transition into a decarbonized economy, and that will happen. But we're still going to be consuming oil and gas for a long time. And by all means, the federal government should be supporting Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland and the oil and gas industry in that part of the world, so that they can get through this and return to some level of wealth creation and work with the rest of the country so that we can get back on our feet.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time, but I thank all three of you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good,
Bob
good
Ray,
to talk to you, Vash.
Ujjal Dusange, and Jean Charest. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.